Okay, let's get right into it. Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is right in the middle of a massive corruption trial. And he's just done something pretty stunning. He's asked the President of Israel for a pardon, which would essentially stop the entire trial cold.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how he's framing this. He's not really talking about the legal side of things at all. Instead, he's pitching this as something for the good of the country, a way to heal a divided nation so he can focus on governing, without what he describes as the impossible distraction of court hearings.
So what's really going on here? That's what we're going to break down. We'll start with the request itself, look at the rules for a pardon, dig into a controversial case from the past, meet the people who have to make the final call, and maybe most importantly, talk about why this matters way beyond the headlines.
All right, let's kick things off with the request itself. Even the president's own office is calling it extraordinary. And that's because it creates this huge, fundamental conflict.
So you've got these two totally different ways of looking at it. On one hand, the Prime Minister is saying this is about national reconciliation, about moving the country forward. But on the other hand, you've got legal experts and his political opponents saying, no way. They see it as a blatant attempt to sidestep the justice system, a leader trying to put himself above the law that applies to every single other citizen.
So, he's made the request. But can he actually get it? Is this even possible? Let's open up the pardon playbook and see how this is all supposed to work.
Okay, so the power itself is written right into Israel's basic law. The president has the authority to pardon offenders and to lighten penalties. Seems simple enough, right? But notice that word offenders. What does that mean for someone who hasn't actually been convicted of anything yet?
And this is where we hit the first major roadblock. The official policy, the one published on the president's own website, is about as clear as it gets. It says clemency requests are only considered after all legal proceedings are over. Netanyahu asking for one in the middle of his trial is a direct clash with this very established rule.
But let's just say, for argument's sake, the president decides to go for it anyway, to ignore that policy. Well, it turns out he doesn't actually have the final say. And this is a really key check on power in the system. Any pardon has to be countersigned by the Minister of Justice. And thanks to a big Supreme Court ruling back in 2010, the minister can refuse to sign in exceptional cases. It's basically a constitutional emergency brake.
So a request like this, it feels unprecedented, and it clearly goes against the rules. But has something like this ever happened before? Well, the answer is yes. Once, in a case that still kind of haunts Israel's legal establishment.
We have to go back to 1986 to something called the Bus 300 affair. In that case, the head of the Shin Bet security service and several of his top guys were given pardons before they were even convicted. The reason given at the time? That a public trial would spill state secrets and do serious harm to national security.
But, and this is a huge but, legal experts are very quick to say, hold on a second, this is not the same thing at all. There are two massive differences. First, back in 1986, the officials involved admitted to what they did. And second, and this is crucial, they all left public service. Netanyahu, on the other hand, insists he's innocent and is very clear that he plans to stay in office. So that historical precedent, it might not be the slam dunk it seems.
Okay, so we've looked at the rules, we've looked at the history. Now let's talk about the people at the center of all this. To really get what might happen next, you have to understand who has the power, what they want, and frankly, what they're afraid of.
It really boils down to three key people. First, you've got Prime Minister Netanyahu. His motivation is pretty obvious. He wants this years-long legal ordeal to be over. Then there's President Isaac Herzog. He's the one with the power to pardon, but he's also supposed to be a non-political figure, and he's boxed in by all this policy and precedent. And finally, you have the Minister of Justice, who's holding that powerful veto pen.
And just to make things even more complicated, there's pressure coming from outside the country. Former U.S. President Donald Trump actually sent a letter to President Herzog urging him to grant the pardon. For Netanyahu's supporters, this is proof of his importance on the world stage. For his critics, it's a completely inappropriate attempt by a foreign power to meddle in Israel's justice system.
All right, so that's the process, the history, and the players. But let's zoom out and ask the most important question of all. Why does any of this matter? How does this high-level political drama actually connect to the lives of everyday people?
Let's just put it bluntly. Who pays the price if this decision chips away at public trust? And who's quietly benefiting if it turns out the rules that apply to everyone else can just be set aside for the powerful?
Because really, when you strip away all the political noise, that's what this is about. It's a fundamental test of one of the core ideas of any democracy. Is everybody equal before the law? Or can arguments about national stability or political necessity create a special exception for the person right at the top?
So, as this whole thing moves forward, here are the two big things you really need to keep your eye on. First, will President Herzog take the unprecedented step of ignoring his own office's policy to consider this pardon mid-trial? And second, if he does, what will the Minister of Justice do? Will they use that powerful but very rarely used authority to block it? In the end, it all really boils down to how you answer this one single question. Is this an act of statesmanship? A leader trying to heal a polarized country? Or is this a man trying to place himself above the law? That is the question facing Israel's leaders and its people right now.